Austrian, Polish, out there. Two months. This school has like this. I mean, you know the. So what? Yes. Like that. So you also this is a very difficult way to get to it. And now it's like anything past that, like here it's successful over here. Even before I think the being now it's the problem sense.
YouTube.
On Facebook as well?
YouTube and Instagram.
Well, what can I say? About tradition. The only is popular book preparation. Well, is in that. Small man. Yes. He goes and asks another guy. He says that. Like, it's really popular. One of the things I mentioned in this book about version is how most of our code it's good to be
Okay. Okay. That exciting because I was before that. Just come out.
Yeah, the second one.
Okay. Sorry.
So,
Okay. Or should it be this?
Now I'm ready to start.
Oh, okay. It works as well.
Well, not yet. This one was very, very fun.
When you started.
This was started. But it only took like. I don't know. They do the roast the show like crash project. Well,
I'll be hosting, asking him some questions, hopefully.
I used to. For some reason, I lost the kitchen. I told my friend I was like, "It's." I know I have. That's all. Those are nice. I have to work with another place.
We're interested to find out.
This is true. Whatever you want to do. That's right. It's a real terrible show. But we're trying to oh, right. Take them out. And let it go.
Oh, serious. I think that's a big part of it. But you got.
Bridge.
You had excerpts published?
So
It's just like the struggle.
what's the already a Chinese under Russian slaves. But that's all. I work with.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I think my microphone is not on. Hello. We're so pleased to have you all here. My name is Shady, and I am, the events manager here at Lost City Books. Just speak up for now. Just before we begin, a few things. If you're brand new here and you've never been to Lost City Books, we are a used, new, and rare bookstore, which means that we have really tightly packed collections of a lot of really cool books that are carefully curated by all of our booksellers and, of course, our book buyers and managers here. So if you have a chance later tonight, take a look around. You might find something more than Why Ukraine Matters that you might like to take a look at. A few things also. Silence your cell phones now out of respect to our speakers today. Can get really annoying in the middle of a nice conversation. So we want to give as much respect as possible to Fazle tonight. Lastly, this event is being live streamed on both YouTube and Instagram. And while none of you are visible, if you choose to ask a question during the Q&A, that question will be a part of the live stream. On the matter of questions, if you do have questions or comments that you'd like to share, please hold them until the portion at the end, which is the Q&A. We'll build in some time for that, for Fazle to answer all of your questions. And at the end, if you haven't already purchased your book, you can grab your copy and buy it downstairs. And if you're lucky, perhaps Fazle will sign it for you. And without anything further, I'd like to introduce Fazle Chowdhury. He studied at Northwestern University and at the Graduate School of Northeastern, my bad. Need a new glasses prescription, everybody. And at the Graduate School of Education at Harvard University. He has written several op-eds connected to Europe and the Middle East. He is a former contributor to Libsyn-based Espresso newspaper, a fellow at the Global Policy Institute, an agile management consultant, and currently spends his time between Montreal and Washington, D.C. Chowdhury is the author of 7 books. His first book, Promises of Betrayals, the history that shaped Iranian Shia clerics, the Kindle edition, won the 2018 Literary Titan Award, and his critically acclaimed novel, Never Among Equals, came second in the 2021 Reader's Favorite Choice Award for Historical Fiction. And now, without further ado, welcome, Fazle Chowdhury. The mic will work.
Yes. Thank you very much for all of you for coming this wonderful cold evening here in Washington, D.C. It's wonderful to be here. I love Lost City Books. It's really a place that a really good friend of mine discovered not too long ago, and I've been coming here ever since. So in context of this book, Why Ukraine Matters, this has been, I've tried to decode as much the complex nature of this book and the complex nature of what this book is speaking of, including the present conflict. So the book is broken into 4 parts. One is, of course, the historical foundation of Kiev and Rus. Then it speaks to how much of Ukraine has worked with in its relationship with Soviet Union and Russia. Third, of course, how the external players in Europe have been affected. And fourth is, of course, the conflict that we are witnessing at present. There have been a lot of decoding on my part, mainly because the foundation of this book was started back in 2002 when I was still a much younger man than I am today. And despite many visits to Ukraine myself, there's been a well over a 10-decade gap, but that decade gap has been kind of streamlined and brought closer primarily because of the help of friends who are there right now, who have been able to provide me the information that I have incorporated in this book. And so with that in place, one of the things I do want to mention in this book is that in this conflict, there's been a lot of moving targets. This book is not about understanding those moving targets, although it has a foundational layer to understand why those targets keep on moving. Why do you have stalemate between Russian and Ukrainian forces? Why do you have this kind of division between the Baltic states and Western Europe? Why do you have this kind of process within the European Union where much of the Western Europe has been integrated well into the European Union, not so much the eastern part? NATO is the Grand Alliance. We used to joke about it back during the time when I lived in Europe, that Paris and Berlin in total has 500 tanks and Russia has 5,000. So why should Russia be afraid of NATO invading Russia? But beyond all that, this conflict also has repercussions in what I described in this book in food politics. Of course, energy is a given, but also the division between energy consumers. There have been a few updates since the book has been released. One of the biggest ones is the fact that OPEC now has kind of streamlined to say that they will limit their production of oil to 2 million barrels. Now, this is very good news for the Kremlin. It's extremely bad news for Biden. He enters into the midterm elections because a lot of that will feed in to the American electorate and the American consumer. But for OPEC, they're taking a stand for the first time to say we will not be bullied into kind of having a fixed price rate when oil is in full demand. And in the event there is a recession, we will respond to it through our terms, not somebody else's. So a lot of those updates that has happened has been mentioned in small part in this book. But I say in this book primarily of these foundations because Ukraine itself was a very fragile state. The present Ukraine that you see today is really a framework of what was left of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Now, President Putin will say that this has been part of Russia for 1,000 years. I mean, there's both half-truths and half-untruths in this. Yes, that is true, but Kiev at one time was, in fact, one of the capital of the Russian Empire. We're looking at the 882 AD. It was moved from Novgorod to Kiev as part of Kievan Rus, but it had a very solemn foundation of Slavic culture. Now that Slavic culture hasn't gone away, but what has happened over the centuries is the fact that you've had an eastern part of Ukraine that has developed more and more into the Soviet sphere, mainly because of the lack of globalization, the lack of funding. A lot of state funding has kind of eroded, not so much on the east, but primarily on the west. And that's because if you look at the electoral graphics, right up till 2014, you see pretty much a divisive electorate. The east has primarily supported Eastern politics. The West has primarily supported Western politicians. The West has primarily supported pro-European candidates, and the East has always supported pro-Russian candidates. Now that all changed after 2014, when the annexation of Crimea took place. Now, as that changed, the relationship with Ukraine also changed with its other players. The United States, somebody asked me a couple of days ago when I had a virtual event that how engaged has the United States been? And I'd like to remind those that believe that, the United States have been engaged in Ukraine for some time, since the Budapest Referendum of Security and Assurances, which guaranteed Ukraine's sovereignty for Ukraine to give up the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons. But that had kind of had an absence between 2019 to 2022. From 2019 to 2022, you did not have an American in Kiev. Now you do. And so one of the reasons why I'd like to highlight that is the fact that you had kind of like what the previous administration had in its Ukrainization of American politics. That's the best way I can term that. And then you've got a de-Ukrainization of American politics with this administration. So all that framework kind of feeds into one thing, is the fact that under this conflict, you have divisions. You have divisions both here in the United States, you have divisions both in Europe, you have divisions even in parts of the world. And that has nothing to do with the fact of whether they are for or against Ukraine. It has everything to do with the fact of how energy prices, gas prices have been floating. With that, I don't want to speak too much, but to really get a feeling of your questions and your thoughts on this book. As I said, it has covered between everything from the foundation of Kievan Rus till now, but one of the things I would like to highlight is the fact that since Ukraine's independence, it has produced politicians that have kind of kept a balance between its Russian interests and its pro-West interests. And that changed, particularly from President Zelensky. not because of this war, but because of his policies that started even before this war. There are a lot of reasons why Russia invaded Ukraine, and most of those reasons have been highlighted in this book. Is it a NATO backlash? I don't believe so entirely. I see you already nodding that. And so this book will explain that. This book will explain a lot of those finite details. And in this book throughout that, I've kind of covered, it's very difficult to cover a country like Ukraine when so many other countries are being affected, because it feeds into every kind of step throughout. Decoding Ukraine is not an easy task, and I'm probably the last person to do it, but I'm glad I did it, because at the end of the day, it makes sense. I'd like to believe that after you read this book, it makes sense, at least a little bit more than what you are witnessing, what you're reading, what is available to you. But yeah, at this point, I'd like to answer your questions.
I'll start. So I'm sure everyone in this room knows that since the war, the recent war in Ukraine has begun, for many people who are not students of global politics and policy, Ukraine has been thrust into the spotlight in a way that hasn't happened in the past couple of years. And I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit on what parts of your book touch on sort of the lead up to this war and the sort of complex relationship between Ukraine and Russia and Ukraine and Europe and the entire sort of global relationship with and dependence on, in some ways, on Ukraine. And for someone like me who doesn't really know a lot about this, can sort of explain a little bit about what parts of your book touch on that. And also, you mentioned earlier that your book is broken down into 4 distinct parts. So if you can kind of elaborate on those distinct parts as well.
Okay. One of the things that when you look in these, one of the reasons I had to break the book into 4 parts. Ideally, for a novelist like myself, I'd like to just streamline between beginning to end. It's much more easier. Readers are satisfied. But if it's not a straight answer, you have to break down that straight answer. So I kind of mentioned that in the context of where does Ukraine actually become part of an issue with Europe? So it comes from the time, as I said, during the breakup of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is broken between the Austrian Habsburgs, the Prussians, and Catherine the Great, born Prussian, but she was a Russian empress. She took a large part of what is today Ukraine. Now, when she took that area, she inherited the Crimean Tatars. She inherited the large Jewish populations. She inherited a significant minority of populations, particularly the Cossacks and the Poles. And this is what basically makes Ukraine very much kind of like the center of a very diverse and very kind of attractive part of Europe, because many European historians have argued about the fact that, okay, what makes Ukraine European? And I've argued in this book that Ukraine produced a princess that married King Henry of France, which basically makes Ukraine very much a part of Europe through its marriage with France. But that narrative has sort of been forgotten now. So there's a part of the European part, there's a part of what Ukraine as it is comes from. Now, how does all this integrate into the realities of a European priority? Well, without Ukraine, Russia can't pass through its gas terminals to Europe. Russia, before this war, was supplying about 40% of the heat of Europe. Now, in 2014, there was significant research done to understand that if Ukraine's infrastructure could be materialized, could be built up, it has potentially the capacity to provide Europe with 60% of gas. Now, whether that can materialize or not, that is a separate matter. But the point of the matter is that Russia has always used Ukraine to pass its gas terminals into Europe. So there's the importance part of how the necessary of heat and some context of basic necessity is important, particularly in terms of Europe and how Ukraine plays a part of it. Now, to make sense of how all this matters to the rest of the world, well, I mentioned food politics. Ukraine used to be the breadbasket of Europe. Russia was also the breadbasket of Europe at a much previous time. Now, a lot of that I've highlighted between kind of like the Russian psychosis of rulers since the time of Lenin. So when Lenin came to power, one of the things that he wanted to do was industrialize Russia. And he wanted to industrialize the Soviet Union. And he, for a while, tempted and flirted with the idea that he would leave Ukraine alone. But he starts on the process of building what is really like stealing grain away from Russia, away from Ukraine and into Russia, which helps basically the foundation for Stalin. Stalin also has his a little more history in Ukraine of basically like taking away food from farmers and integrating that within the process of Russian industrialization campaign. Now, it doesn't stop there. This psychosis kind of goes on even to his successor, Khrushchev, who doesn't necessarily attack Ukraine or steal from Ukraine, but rather wants to expand its border into Poland and into expanding the Soviet borders. But this psychosis kind of takes a different turn too, because like if you look at every Russian successor of Stalin, Khrushchev comes in as a modernizer, but something happens to him in the 60s and he's removed. Brezhnev comes in as his successor and is looked upon by the Politburo as the successor and can revitalize the Russian economy. He's very attractive in the very beginning, but for some reason, something happens to him and he's basically starts interfering in Czechoslovakia. His predecessor, Khrushchev, also interfered in Hungary. When Brezhnev leaves, Gorbachev comes in, and Gorbachev kind of says, like, okay, let me undo what I can. But the problem is, he unlocks this genie in a bottle to say, all right, if democratic processes can work, let's see how it does work. And that's why you have this kind of a wave of kind of like, I think there was a poll done by Pew on how much popular Gorbachev was in context to Putin. And though Putin wasn't popular, Gorbachev wasn't popular either. Actually, he fared much worse. So what you have is the psychosis of strongman politics and using Ukraine as a punching bag. And so there you have food politics, importance to Russia, importance to Europe, and where does all this feed in when it comes to the United States? Well, the United States, prior to the annexation of Crimea, did have, like I said, was committed to the Ukrainian project through the Budapest security assurances. It safeguarded. There was mostly in West, unfortunately. After 2014, you kind of see more of a military aid, less of economic buildup, because I think most European powers, including the United States, saw after the annexation of Crimea that the military threat was much more pronounced than the economic one. And that has remained intact. I hope that answers your question. It's a fairly long one.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. And I want to talk about why you decided to structure the book the way that you did, and also in the many years of research and this into these essays, what are some experiences that you had that informed your current positions that you put in these essays, if you will.
Yeah, so I had written a piece on Ukraine in one when I was in university, and not liked by my advisor. She didn't think it was a great paper, but decent grade. But I forgave her for it now, but I'm fondly over. But the law foundation of the Kiev and Rus in this book is from that era and from that research. Now, where that kind of gravitates to the present is on the nature of how NATO has shaped up, how the European Union has become. And things that I found particularly difficult was journalists, particularly in the online space. They were complete. Russia too is a signatory of the Budapest on security, so that means they too guaranteed the sovereignty of Ukraine. But those that I did speak to, well, that was under Yeltsin era, not under Putin. So we don't really count that as something that we honor. And so I had difficulty understanding, okay, what kind of song that has a scope and a straight answer. As I came to ask people that I admire, particularly foreigners and even my former bosses, the answer to was complicated. That complicated, I would spend hours trying to say, where does this make sense? And more particularly, do I believe it makes sense? And at a time when I came across this situation, while they were negotiating to not have a conflict with Russia, have this conflict in Ukraine explode. That's so I kept on thinking serious about it. And why is trade continuing? It's like saying, oh, I'm not going to come let's shop at your store. I want 2 apples, 4 oranges. That's it. And a whole lot of diamonds. But as I did that, I also came to find out that the Yeltsin era was a little different compared to the Putin era in the context that so the oligarchs during the Yeltsin era, they were actually pretty scared how to build their wealth. I mean, the ones that did do well, they didn't do it. They thought this was their thing. It was like really a dangerous step that as I uncovered. You would have big mashes between the railway station and the fields, and the problem is not so much, but you need to figure out a way to transport a lot of this in like a pipeline situation. How would you do that? Well, you needed construction, you needed bridges. Going to get to a place where it's so remote, and so the Yeltsin oligarchs, in many ways, they were trying to figure out, okay, how can I bring logistically things that can connect? Whereas the Putins seem to be kind of embedded in state structure, and to be like you're just one layer of how this is particularly sense. There was another where one of the oligarchs from the Yeltsin era said that one of the jokes was that they would build something and say, can I take at least 100 barrels? Can we even dig that? And look at this guy and say, come tomorrow. You right. But that was the situation they had. They were kind of really like step by step from the ground up, which is not the case for Delta. Like now are sanctioned, their bank accounts frozen, they're having to move to up the States, a large number of Russian nations in Dubai are trying to get out, like just like some form of normal doing business. So yeah.
Just one more from me. Everyone will have their turn.
Sure.
As you mentioned earlier, a lot has changed in Ukraine even since you finished the book. Wondering if you had to write another essay on what happened since you finished Why Ukraine Matters, what you focus on, and what would you want to illuminate for your reader about the things that have changed since the end of the book?
I would really love, in some way, for Ukraine look as prospects of exporting diesel and gas. But I mean, truth be told, Russia lives on petroleum. It doesn't make too much money out of gas, and even if it does, it's not going to out of it now, certainly, because buyer was in Europe. But I would like to see the news of, particularly Kiev has control over in playing kind of like an as to really compete against Russia so that they can use that, build whatever framework they in the aid and actually make a serious case, not just to the rest of the world that they're worth fighting for, but to say that, you know, we can. I'd really like to write about that. Unfortunately, no.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open the questions up to the audience now, if you all have anything to ask or share.
Could you specifically why Ukraine, not the US? We're setting an awful lot of
It's kind of complicated. I'll try to streamline. One is really to sample, in addition to the integration of other Eastern European countries. So we've been very integrating Poland, the Baltic states. Ukraine's, it's really close to the finishing line, but falling short. It was falling short even before this crisis, but it's not a quick fix. It is an avenue, I believe, that will benefit, and that relationship will reciprocate well, just like how Poland has reciprocated with the United States after the disbanding of the Soviet Union. I think Ukraine has a lot of in its framework. It can control 100% of its borders, which it can't. But what it can, I think the economic, the population, as well, policy between real and when I say real integration, we're bringing our into Ukraine and making Ukraine has built democracy since, and it's shown because it has the process of that every president, at least the first few presidents, had balanced between Russia and the West. In this, I think President Zelensky really has the opportunity, if to make Ukraine a success, because it's a member of the European Union, but because it's one of the biggest heavyweights in the eastern part of Europe, and that translates into industries. We're talking about gas, we're talking about chemical materials. There's this book where I about about union politicians saying that there's an uprising right-wing elements, and that is because of immigration. That is because of some of the migration, because of the wars in Afghanistan. And why should we priority? And I is the fact that if you don't make Ukraine a priority, you will have a state at the heart of Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe. Large area to have that is a liability. And you should pay attention to that. Paid attention to this right from the First World War, the Second World War, and even during the crises in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I guess, and I'm just trying to really the tangible. So partner, is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. Anything else? As a partner, as a so are there?
Not so much partner itself, but I mean, Ukraine already has its own version of democracy. It's not perfect, but it's there. I would argue that has partnership that has that helps at a time when you have European countries exactly states.
Nuclear risk on fertilizer.
Well, and there's like
One of them.
The nuclear risks were always there. Because you did witness a version some time ago. You might have heard about that. So, how I say Kiev kind of magic where it did itself because of the way how just and it's not just architectural makeup, it's the population that's been there. As far as energy is concerned, Ukraine is significantly hotbed of energy compared to its west. And more the takeover of key areas you get that with playing Ukraine hostage than anything. But there's another part. A couple of weeks ago, it was one of the I was by a professor in England who specialized on the black. You did not speak anything about Odessa, and I said no, I did. I believe the kind of the in Kiev, in the sense that how the economy is getting, and that's through the transport of wheat. So I argue that Pope Francis would have been the mediator. Circumstances made President better because he was in a position to strike a deal with President Putin, at least move and or actually reach the states that are really in trouble right now. It's going to Lebanon, where Lebanon has there's a Yemen about 40% of that wheat, and that also plays war. So I describe these elements, but I describe these elements to say that this is all, and I'd like it to be permanent, but nature of that will. I hope it. And so far, there hasn't been any signs that what's going to be up. but so far, I think yeah.
A few years ago, Putin expressed the words. He said, of Russians. And people get influence. All this long before, but we never saw that they started to this large scale offensive toward their brotherhood people, and they started to shelling this city, which they say that nearly the whole city for whole Russians, whole Slavic world, and so on. Let's imagine that they managed to seize whole Ukraine. What will happen next? Next probably can be Kazakhstan and South Caucasus.
I think it'd be more Moldova than Kazakhstan.
Moldova, this is an issue for 24 hours.
Yeah.
24 hours, no more. They don't have any serious army or something like that. What I mentioned this issue, Kazakhstan, Russia, and Ukraine. This is the three major grain suppliers and very important countries for food security for entire third world countries. And beside that, Kazakhstan, one of the major producers of oil and gas, Russia, oil and gas. And if they manage to seize Georgia, they cut Azerbaijani oil and gas and Turkmen oil and gas. And under these circumstances, Russia become more and more dangerous and more important because they will control tremendous amount of food, gas, and oil. And what will happen this time? You know, how these Europeans can deal with it? I don't see any scenario then Europe can solve this issue without United States involved. That's why for United States and for UK probably, because I understand that France and Germany nearly give up, to better solve this problem now than to waiting for aggravation of this situation. Because if nobody stops him right now, this is like the Hitler issue, kind of second issue. Because when they seized part of Georgia, Abkhazia and Ossetia, nothing happened. They seized Crimea, nothing happened. They occupied part of this Donbass, big part of Donbass, really nothing happened. And these steps is encouraging, actually. If this tremendous amount of sanctions would be applied during 2008 Georgia-Russia war, maybe probably we can avoid all these atrocities.
So there's a number of things that you touched on, and yeah, it's there. That's what I'll say. But let me break it down for a little bit. So Kazakhstan, as you know, had a riots back in January this year, and the Russians actually rushed over. I think it was like around 5,000 troops were sent, and I think within 3 days they restored order. Yeah, you're right. Kazakhstan does have a large oil and gas framework,
and big Russian population,
and a large Russian population, Russian-speaking population.
Ethnically Russian.
Ethnically Russian, and yes. One of the reasons I think, even if President Putin does have control over Kazakhstan or half of Ukraine, I don't think countries like Azerbaijan will be affected because Azerbaijan took the opportunity through the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceylan pipeline to build an independent pipeline straight into Europe without touching any Russian terminal points. So you can still say that he has control over that part, but not so much that route.
Russian troops from 25 kilometers from Baku.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
And this is nothing for them to reach the service.
Right. But the case I'm trying to relay here is that if you look in the conflict of oil, if you look at the transport of oil, if you look at the transport of gas, within this arena of Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey, yes, there's potential of problems, but there's more reason to believe that that will not be affected, mainly because of the players involved. Because I think it would be beneficial for the Kremlin to have an area where they can have a leverage to negotiate. Keep in mind, all conflicts need to have some space of negotiation. If you remove all negotiation, just
Welcome to Russia.
welcome to Russia. Yeah.
Welcome to Russia.
Yeah. Actually, there's a part in this book from a friend of mine who is Russian, who now lives in London, who said to me that there's Russian populations there. The only thing that stands in our way is one thing: democracy.
I have a question.
Yes.
We see how Iran is supplying more and more weapons to Russia to aid their offensive or defensive. We've seen already the shellings and drone attacks from Shahid, Iranian-made drones. And there is now a growing fear on the Ukrainian side that there will be more missiles, long-range missiles supplied to Russia. I've heard today that the Ukrainians are almost ready to withdraw the Iranian ambassador from here. How do you see this will affect the Iran-American relations? Missiles, that's what I see. Especially with the nuclear deal with Iran. Because it's an interesting turn of events. I would never think that Iran would be as much supportive to Russia in this regard.
Well, I mean, there's a so there are two kind of frameworks here that I'm going to try to margin in to answer this question. One is, this is the first few months of President Raisi's government taking hold of Iran, and I think this has been 8 years since you've had conservative ayatollahs in Tehran. And the conservative ayatollahs, if you think about it, they never really wanted the Iran nuclear deal to go ahead anyway. But they also did not have any other options. They're under sanctions, they cannot do trades, but their option is in other underground networks, primarily through the banks in Beirut, primarily through banks in Baghdad.
Dubai.
And Dubai, and other sources. But my point to you is that you have a dual option scenario, which is, at one hand, you will have the scenario where they will be pushing to get the JCPOA approved and back to normal. But on the other hand, they will still try to work with, at a very minimum, with Moscow in some capacity. Now, when you think about it, drone attacks are limited engagement.
But long-range missile attacks.
Long-range missiles,
It gets serious.
yes, it can get serious. I'd like to believe it won't get to that, but if it does, then that would mean that the conservative ayatollahs in Tehran have taken a stand, and they permanently want to move away the moderate frameworks of President Rouhani or whatever he's built. Now, they can do that, but I think you are having a significant opposition to this administration at this time. And I think a lot of that has roots to the fact that during the time when the JCPOA was working, you had certain number of intellectuals, primarily in the sciences, who have gained ground and built influences in Europe. And that has kind of given some semblance of inspiration to Iranians to say that, okay, JCPOA may not have worked, but when it does work, or if JCPOA 2.0 comes back, that would look very different from the previous one. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily a pro-US. It doesn't also necessarily mean a pro-Russia. What it does mean is a pro-Iran, moderate or continued.
Pro-regime.
Well,
They want to defend, I mean, they want to defend their regime.
I think they want to keep in place. Well, actually, no. I'm sorry. With what I'm seeing recently, I wrote 2 books on Iran before this, and when I was researching on the JCPOA, one of the surveys that I remember encountering was that while Iranian youth were not exactly pro-Chinese products or pro-Russia products, they were most definitely pro-American products. And the JCPOA had enough of a feeling that American consumer goods would come to Iran. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean pro-American government.
They send their children here, United States,
Yeah.
to Canada.
I mean, before this war, I think most of the Kremlin's higher ups had their children in New York universities.
During seizure of Crimea, the daughter of Bratko, he was the head of Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. His daughter was here in Las Vegas celebrating her birthday.
Yeah.
Like when this Crimea so-called referendum happened, during these days, she was here.
Yeah.
And daughter of Lavrov, and daughter of some of Iranian daughters and sons of some of Iranian officials. Also, they educate here.
Yeah. I mean, this had been coming up quite a lot in social media circles, and I think there was a journalist I was interviewing, and I said, doesn't it make the politicians or even Foreign Minister Lavrov's position difficult when you have your children in the U.S. and at the same time you're creating problems? And
His daughter is U.S. citizen. She has
protection
passport.
Yeah. So I don't have too much details on that, but I remember one of the things she said to me was that it's very easy for these individuals to do this as they commit to the Kremlin's aims. But it will get difficult if there is a war. And then when the war happened, what happened? These folks immediately left. Yeah. Where they would have access. Yeah. The normal current cities. Yeah. That answers. Yeah. Thank you.
Time for 1 or 2 more.
Yeah. One other thing
part of conversation. I see it's part of conversation. Okay, few months ago I was in Dubai. I frequently travel to Dubai for vacation or according to my business, and I saw the Russians. They had some business in Dubai or they travel to Dubai, but I never seen so many Russians. Dubai for this time became kind of Russian-speaking city. I mean, the GBR area, this fancy area, it's not Karama or something like that. And a tremendous amount of Russians came to Dubai, some of them through Kazakhstan, through Uzbekistan, through Azerbaijan, Georgia, Armenia, and so on, through Qatar. And of course, the part of Russian elite also, I mean, their families came to Dubai because this is comfortable for them. And we know that Dubai is one of the major financial hub for Iran. And now we understand that Dubai will become one of the major financial hub for Russia because of this sanction. And if European Union and United States apply the sanction and they create some backdoors to avoid this sanction, and not only from Dubai, actually, Dubai is one example, there are other examples also. What will happen with these countries who allow such kind of existence of such kind of backdoors?
So
The sanction will not work.
So there were these tensions that I saw. I mean, basically, so when you look at the first round of sanctions after the annexation of Crimea, these sanctions are specifically not that harmful as the ones that you see right now. Okay, so, but I think the first round of sanctions were even more dangerous because it gave, especially those who are going to be affected, enough of an indication that, okay, there needs to be another way to move our way of doing business. Now, at this time, one of the things that I worry about is the fact that there are countries that have given access to Russia to trade. For instance, India has a very, I think, a set rate of purchasing oil from.
With great discount.
That's right, yeah. But it's very unclear who sets the rate, whether it's Russia, whether it's India, it's a matter of debate. But what I'm alluding to is the fact that the Kremlin saw this coming. So if they had enough indication to create an alternative layer of doing business, knowing full well they would be severely more sanctioned, then I can even go as far as to say that when you see Russian populations move into Finland, Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Turkey, there's enough indication and reality to realize that yes, you will have Russian consumers and Russian money being converted. But also keep in mind that when this war happened, one of the largest Italian banks saw a complete wipeout of basically capital that was held. And I mentioned this in this book in the sense that even before the annexation of Crimea, you had significant amount of Russian capital housed in pockets of Europe. And European banks are particularly sensitive about having these large elements of capital just leaving their networks. So you can ask yourself, okay, does it convert into blockchain? Does it convert into local currencies of other sorts? One of the things that I've uncovered was the fact that it's kind of like a ring circus. You pay, you sell oil, you get the revenue, but you don't bring the revenue. You park it somewhere else. And you park it somewhere else so you can make more money. And so you don't necessarily touch that capital. It's growing, but it's undetected. And this is one of the problems for regulators, and particularly like one of the people that I interviewed, particularly to understand, like, so if you remember that one of the first governments to assist President Zelensky in his effort was the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
Yeah.
But London houses one of the largest Russian capitals on earth. Okay.
Undoubtedly.
And
And
so
not only on UK, but also the oversized territory.
that's right. And so, and like you said, it's just not the UK, but you see the US Virgin Islands, Cyprus, there is a network. Okay. So if the British Prime Minister was confident enough within own regulators that those cash capitals would be either seized or monitored, then maybe he was testing the ground to understand, okay, under the terms of Brexit, will it have a very much of a leverage beyond Ukraine, beyond the European Union over Ukraine? And the truth of the matter is, I don't think that is an issue. I don't think Russian capital that is being housed in different parts of the world is so much of an issue, because think about it. The European Union is paying 38 billion euros to Russia till the end of 2022. And out of that 38 billion, in addition to that, 1 billion is going to supply Ukrainian troops to fight Russia. So money may be a factor, but it's not that much of a factor when it comes in the geopolitical scale, because at the end of the day, it's about commodities. And commodities are particularly, I think commodities at the end of the day is more harmful than the capital, because what you see in what is happening in Sri Lanka, they did not adjust their commodity rates prior to the Ukraine conflict. The currency crashed. Pakistan is in a similar situation. And I've noticed this, I mentioned this in this book, that it's, there are other countries who are affected by this currency problem, but their currency problem is rooted to not leveraging between their commodities to the conflict. They kind of said, okay, we'll subsidize it. We'll subsidize it because we believe the conflict won't last. Well, it is going to last. And it's going to last. And I mentioned in this book that, you've got conflicts in the past, Lebanese civil war, the Afghan war, the Iranian Revolution, the Syrian civil war right now. These are elements you're looking that is going to go between 10 to 15 years. And we should be mindful of the fact that maybe Ukraine conflict right now might, let's hope not, but could go in that way too. Yeah.
So one of the things that I struggle with, right, as an English speaker and reader, is that our media is going to portray certain versions of reality, right? And so we constantly see these fairly positive depictions of Ukrainian military successes, and yet the actual battle lines do not change that drastically at the time. And so I'm wondering if you think that the English speaking media is actually accurate in how it depicts those and how it depicts the situation in terms of the military structure, and if you think that it is, as seems to have been the portrayals happening in the last 2 months, shifted dramatically in the Ukraine's favor, knowing that when we look at wars with civil war context, and we know that because of the issues between the Russian speaking and the Ukrainian speaking populations, you could look at this conflict as having significant civil war aspects, and therefore being sort of a long-term fight. And therefore, in order to shift the actual terms of the battle or the engagement, you have to have enormous outside support to really shift it right? So do you think that has happened? Do you think that is actually occurring? And do you think that the English-speaking media's depictions of what's going on the ground is accurate?
Yeah, so I think the English-speaking media does touch on the realities, but not the greater reality. The reality is that Ukrainian troops are doing well on the ground, but the reality is also the fact that they need help, and they need help in the context of frequent supply, frequent aid, frequent assistance of what this administration is providing through economic aid, through HIMARS, weapon systems, but it's not enough. And I mentioned this in this book, is that during the Afghanistan and Iraq conflicts, there's a certain number of funding that went into these conflicts. When you look at the Ukraine conflict, that number has not even come close. So what that means is, at least the way how I understand it, is that yes, the Ukrainian troops are doing well, but they need help persistently. And in the event you have a change in administration, particularly with the priorities of what may happen in context with Taiwan, if that also becomes an avenue for this administration to take on, that's a cause of concern, particularly for Ukrainian troops. Now, in terms of what you mentioned about you would need an outside power to basically push this over to the finishing line. World War I was a stalemate until the United States got in the last year. World War II would have been a stalemate had the United States not been in there. In this conflict too, one of the things I mentioned is the United States is well embedded in the NATO alliance, and it carries significant weight in the way how the alliance makes its decisions. There is a feeling that Ukrainian politicians want American troops to fight this war, but I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. I think it's a good thing that they have confidence in American firepower, but I think the real strength here is to really assist Ukraine politically, diplomatically, and through aid in its military setup. Now, that too has consequences. And I draw those consequences particularly from the lessons of American forces in Iraq and American campaigns in Afghanistan. I think there's a big portion of that mentioned in this book, and the chapter is called Zelensky's Bane. And I think that chapter will perfectly answer the question that you tried to touch upon. But at the end of the day, this conflict, if it has to be won, it has to be won by Ukraine.
Say a little bit about your time in Ukraine and people that you admire or go over from. I know you maybe can't mention their names, but
You know, I mean, I went at a time when, you know, I was very new to this. You know, I mean, I myself, you know, you know, my parents were diplomats. They moved every 4 years, so I kind of had a feeling that it won't be any different, but it was very, very different because one of the things I do mention in this book is that during my first visit, I had spoken to people my age who said that they wanted to work in Paris, they wanted to work in London, and by that time in my life, I had worked in one of those three cities, and I didn't really think it was all that right. But their rationale was, no, this is if the youth in Warsaw can do it, if the youth in Budapest can do it, why can't we? So I certainly got this feeling that there was this huge potential, but it was kind of weird because just as I had that conversation, a few blocks later, where I engaged with another person, they said, no, being in Moscow is great. We spend vacations there. We love our time there. No, you know, it's wonderful to take vacations, but we'd love to, this is our home. And so I was a little conflicted. It was, on one side, you had these very nationalistic feelings. On the other side, it was really like catching up to the rest of Europe. And I think like over time, that curiosity never, I mean, I still haven't found an answer to it. You know, I mean, this book has covered remnants of history and even economics and even how Ukraine has fared well economically, but it's always had populations in other parts of Europe. And even after this conflict, there has been populations who've gone back and they've now resettled, and they're pretty much, I think they understand this is a danger, but this is a danger they're willing to live with, as opposed to live anywhere else. It's really sad. I mean, I spoke to a friend of mine who lives in eastern part of Germany, and they had housed a Ukrainian family, and that family went back, and they were like, no, please don't go. I mean, we can certainly make things work. And they were like, no, we thought this would be a conflict, but it's our home.
Thank you, everyone, for your wonderful questions. Just to close it out, what is an insight from that a reader can draw from your book that can help them make sense of what's going on right now? If you had to name just like a core insight that you feel is present in the work.
There's two chapters in this book. One is called Zelensky's Bane, and the other one is it's the global effect. It's the global effect. I think the actual title is that way. Yeah, I mean, you spend months writing it, and then you're like, you forget what you titled it. But yes, the global repercussions. That was 2.0. Yeah. So if you look at these two chapters, they are alarmist chapters because they say how this conflict affects all of us. Yeah, I mean, like, you know, the book is 160,000 words, and I understand it's not a light read, but for anything else, I'd like to urge readers to at least read those two chapters because I mean, those two chapters are short enough compared to the others. But if you read those chapters, they are a very good indication of how this conflict is particularly something to be concerned about.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. To our audience and of course to these graduates. Everyone, please take the moment to mingle, chat with each other for a bit. Just so you know, Lost City Books closes at 9 p.m. You won't be rushed out, but in case you were wondering about that.
10 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Sorry.